All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about vectors and give you kind of an overview of vectors and frankly why they're awesome. So talking about arrays before, this is kind of the setup that we have. An array has to be at this point in time statically defined. And I use that term loosely, by the way. But what I mean by it is that it has to be defined with a constant size at the editor portion here that we're in. So you have to give it a constant size and it only can have that size and you're kind of locked within those constraints. Now that's at this point in time. The reason being is because the array ends up being declared on the stack, which is a portion of memory that we talked about way back in the early lecture. We're going to talk about that again once we get to pointers. But anyway, the arrays are declared on the stack. And then we have the vectors coming in here, and they're actually declared on the heap, which means that's the dynamic memory allocation layer. So the good news is that we have this sort of elastic type structure where we can expand and contract the vector container. We don't really have that capability at this time with the array. So the vector kind of comes in as this ultimate powerhouse for being that's easily sizable container. So yeah, let's go ahead and just quickly get into this here, and I'll just go ahead and put in the parts that we're always going to need in this class of our program. Now, in order to get vector uh, as a actually recognizable thing, it belongs to another library. We got to bring it in. It's part of the STL library. And what we need to do is we need to pull in vector. Okay, so include vector, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show you the actual bringing it into main as a initialization and so on. So what I'm going to do is show you three different parts of it and how to declare it. That's the first part is using the keyword vector. The next part, the second part, is going to be the actual data type behind whatever it is that you're going to store in this vector. So if you have a vector of ints, int needs to go here. If you have a vector of char, string, an abstract data type, whatever you want, you can put right here. I'm going to choose to put string in here, and I think where my head's at right now is I want to make a list of things. Yeah, let's do that. So then the third part, and final part of this declaration is you need the identifier. That's the name. So just name it whatever you would accordingly. And that's the most basic setup for an absolutely empty vector. Now, when I say empty, it's empty, meaning there's no elements in here. So there's not an element 0, there's not an element 1, there's nothing in here. So if I try to access any element in this vector here, it's not going to do it. It's going to say it doesn't exist, and so on. I'm going to get an error simply because there is no vector element to address. So I need to be very careful about that. So just to iterate here, what calamity we could run into. Um, Vectors allow you to use the same container type notation. What I mean by that is the a subscript that you would normally do with an array. So say like list, and then you have the subscript here, these square brackets. It's exactly what I'm talking about. So say if you were wanting to say, I want element 0 out of list to be milk, something like that's my list. This here would present a problem. The problem would be is that it's trying to access an element 0. Element 0 doesn't exist, so this is going to be an issue. So that's what I mean by that. I also mean to show you, hey, look at this. You can also use the same notation that you're already used to. Once the vector is created, you can then use it exactly like an array throughout the rest of the program. So, but let me not get ahead of myself. Let me go ahead and include a string in here as well, just to make sure that everything's good and savvy there. Let me get rid of this problem here and show you the proper way to do this. So What you actually have to end up doing is you need to push a new element into this vector. And so you have to create an element and then you have to populate it. Now that's a two-step process, but the vector is very helpful in giving you an actual function to do both of those things in one. That's great. So to do that, what we simply just need to do is we need to use something called the pushback function. So to use that, we're going to have list dot. Now this dot notation, this kind of maybe came out of nowhere for you. Um, you might have used this a little bit further back where you had like, cn.get, cn.ignore, cn. And you might have seen that kind of creep up and pop up. This is something that you use once you get to the level of treating uh, things as objects and so on. And it's a way to call something by its name and then say, you go perform this action or give me this property or so on, so on. That's a basic explanation for now. Know though that simply just because we're at this level where we need to define basics, but these basics also have the ability to expand into further deeper functionality. There might be some dependencies here and there where we come across some things like that. So stay with me on that for now, and we'll go ahead and just kind of keep moving through. Pushback, there we go, is the name of this function. So we have list.pushback is the name of this function, and then inside of the argument field here, we need to actually give it the value. Now pushback is going to create the element. We need to provide it with the argument, which is the piece of data that it's going to put into that element. So milk, perfectly acceptable to put up in this argument because that's what we wanted. We wanted to add milk to our list here. So here we go. Pushback milk. There it is. All right, great. So now I have an element 0. So I could turn around and I could do something like cout and then do list, okay, at position 0 and then end line. All right, so we have list at position 0 and we're going to print it out, and I have an element there to print out. Everything should go good. So I'm going to go ahead and go debug, start without debugging. There it is. There's my milk. All right, so that was just a real quick basic of how to add an element to the vector, how to give it a value, how to retrieve that value and access the information, and how to initialize a vector to start. I'm going to make another video right after this that's going to define how to actually pass vectors around in functions, get them populated, and do a lot of that cool stuff. So stick around for that and see that in part 2.